Now, in this part of the session, the objective is to understand how financial planning relates to growth. This is more complex than it might seem. So, in most of our financial plans, we will put growth. We will assume that the revenues will keep growing the following years because the company is doing well and more customers want to buy our products. Does it make sense? Is it always the case that companies keep growing forever? How does this work? So does it mean that we will be having this concept of organic growth? So we will sell more units forevermore? After the simulation, you can see that this is not always the case. So there is a moment where our market gets saturated, a new technology comes in, new competitors come in, and sometimes we will not just keep selling more and more units every month after every month. This is the reality in most cases for most companies. So what does usually happen in those situations? What we usually see is that companies and their managers look for alternatives. They look for options. There is this very nice book called Build, Borrow or Buy. This is written by Capron and Mitchell, and it's published by HBS Publishing, the Harvard Business Press. Sorry. So, what do they explain in that book? They basically explain that we have different options to sustain growth. What they say is that it's not always the case that we just have to end up doing M&A operations, like mergers and acquisitions. It's not always the case that we have to just end up buying or acquiring another company or business division from a competitor. There are other options that we often forget. What they try to do is that when we identify that to sustain growth, there is a gap, there are some resources that we need, there is a market that we want to access, then we should be going through this process that helps us to find possible options that we can use. So, for example, in cases where we identify that there is that gap, but maybe we have an internal resource that we can use, then maybe it makes sense that we try to build those resources so that we can achieve growth by using those resources that makes us different. In other situations, what might happen is that we can borrow a resource that is available in the market. If that resource is very tradable, very easy to access it, maybe we don't even need to buy it. We can just borrow it. For the time that we need it, we can integrate, we can use it. And this is the case when we end up using it for like a contract or licensing. Another option is that, for example, this resource comes or is easier to use if we are close to that partner that is using the resource. Maybe we cannot get it, or it's not easy to just move it next to us. So then what we might be doing is building an alliance. And it's important that we have some compatibility with the partner goals and that we can create this narrow collaboration. Then we see that only in the last case, we might actually be trying to buy and to acquire those resources. But this means that we also have to assess whether the target, the firm that we want to acquire, is it a feasible target? Is it something that we can do? Can we actually integrate it with us? We have seen from previous research that most of the M&A operations don't create the value that a priori we were expecting to have. Most of them destroy value. So this actually helps us to kind of follow a more structured approach when we want to achieve growth and we want to get those resources that we might not have internally, that we go through this more systematic but also critical approach to try to identify how we can do this. I mentioned and I added here a few comments on why this potential acquisition of another company is also destructive. Usually we observe that there is maybe very strong differences in the corporate culture. Maybe the key personnel will leave the company and start a new project. A lot of times we see overstatement of the projects and the potential of the projects. And we also see that a lot of those technologies that seem to be very promising, actually similar to what happens to our internal projects, they also don't make it to market. This is why we mention this as a broader perspective, a more structured approach. We will spend time looking for examples of each of those cases and trying to discuss them, and why this makes sense, and how we can integrate those elements in our financial planning. Each of those elements has a different type of impact in the organization. And this is an important element that we will be covering and discussing. In this last part of the session, we will be covering elements related to profit planning. So what are we doing here? We are just briefly reviewing aspects related to how do we do the accounting for production costs. It's important we remember that most of those costs we are discussing material costs, and we can classify them in two types: direct cost, indirect costs. When we talk about indirect cost, we always need a criteria to allocate them. It means that we need to establish an element, a driver, that helps us to know how we should allocate that amount that we have into a specific product, into a specific production process, so that they can be correctly allocated to that project or product. As an example, factory overheads. That's often not a direct material cost, so it is one of those indirect costs that is difficult to allocate. How do I do that? Maybe I can just do it by looking at the number of units that have been produced during that day and try to distribute them accordingly. Maybe different products have been produced during that day, so I look at how many units of each of those products, and then I just allocate the amounts of the total factory overheads. But then we can also discuss that maybe it makes more sense that we use the number of hours, for example, for electricity, or for the water being used by the machines, or other aspects that might be related, for example, paint, or other aspects that are used during the production, or other components. As you will be able to see, there are many different potential drivers. Maybe it's the number of employees that are working in that production, or in that department, or in that business unit. Furthermore, we can also combine criteria. So we can do half of the cost allocated by number of units, the other percentage by, let's say, number of hours, and maybe another percentage by the number of employees. What we try to do is that we try to make the best possible allocation of those indirect costs. This will help us to do better decisions when it comes to production, because this at the end is the cost that will give us also the margins for each of those products. It's more complex and more important than it might seem when you first look at this topic. A partial example. Here we only look at material cost and we only look at direct material cost. But this is the very rich example of, the case, for example, here it's the Apple iWatch. We will spend time here, we will be discussing, looking at all those different costs, and also we will be discussing how many dollars per unit we think that we can allocate for the production of each unit of this, in this case, this watch done by Apple. After you take a break by looking at these numbers, the next point here is to try to also understand the difference between variable, fixed costs, and also mixed costs. The mixed cost is this case where we can see kind of like something like a steps, that there is a threshold, and once that production threshold is hit, then a new level either of variable cost or fixed cost kicks in. And that the best way to do this is that you try to draw a graph for each of the cases, and then try to whether you can make sense that when you increase the number of units, which is the marginal cost of each unit, by allocating both the direct cost and in this case the indirect costs that it might have. That's a different way of discussing and of thinking about the production costs that we might have. This is basically related to the units, the volume that we are using. Here it's important to have this moment and to also think about what happens when a company, for example, most of their costs are variable, or a company that most of the cost, the bigger proportion of cost, is a fixed cost. You will see that this influences on the flexibility that the company has to fix prices or to stop producing during a moment maybe that the prices are low, or increase production in a moment that the prices are high, and then you can take advantage and let's say sell more units, taking advantage of your cost structure. This is an important element as it affects the competitive behavior that we see in the market. Finally, this is just as a useful tool when we now try to do calculations for projects or for some of the simulations we have been playing, is to try to understand, for example, how do I use the contribution margin per unit to estimate and to know, for example, how many units do I need to produce to break even. Other options is that I also can look maybe at the cost volume profit analysis. What is the sales that I need to get that minimum profit that I want to achieve? Or also, for example, to understand what is my margin of safety. So when I go out to sell or when I go out to do a forecast, am I playing with only a 5% margin of safety, or do I have a 20-25%? So yeah, I might have done a mistake, or there might be issues in the market, but I'm still quite safe. Now it's the moment that we will take another break and we will go to assignment 3 to try to see how it is going and to clarify doubts.